In Cairo, a muezzin calls faithful Muslims to prayer. It's the same call that sounds 5 times a day, every day in cities across the world. Nearly a quarter of the people on earth respond to it, bound together by the enduring spirit of Islam. God is most great, the muezzin calls. I testify there is no other God but God. I testify Muhammad is the messenger of God. In the unfolding of history, Islamic civilization has been one of humanity's grandest achievements. To a far greater extent than Western records might suggest, it was Islam that laid the cultural and scientific foundations on which the modern world is based. It was Muslim scholars who reclaimed the ancient wisdom of the Greeks, while Europe languished in the Dark Ages. It was they who sowed the seeds of the Renaissance, 600 years before the birth of Leonardo da Vinci. From the way we heal the sick, to the numerals we use for counting, cultures across the globe have been shaped by Islamic civilization. But all this began with the life of a single ordinary man and the profound message he proclaimed that would change the world forever. For Muslims, Muhammad was God's last prophet on earth. Who was he? His life is revered as much for its mysteries as for its certainties.
The Prophet has 3 portraits. One painted by his enemies, another painted by his devotees. The third one, which we as historians and people looking at the truth, is the one of the historical Muhammad that we must recover if we are going to present the Prophet in a proper way.
No image of Muhammad's face has ever been recorded, but we do know that Muhammad was born in or around 570 AD in the sun-blasted Arabian Peninsula, a land of savage scarcity, whose Bedouin tribes were locked in a constant state of tribal war. While still an infant, Muhammad's parents gave him his first taste of life in the desert.
The Arabs thought that the virtues that they prized most highly, courage, generosity, eloquence in poetry, and understanding of the natural world, were things that the Bedouin continued to teach. And so a great many patrician families in Mecca would send their sons to the desert to acquire those things.
By the time Muhammad was 6, both of his parents had died, and he was taken under the protection of his uncle, chief of his clan.
In some ways, it was detrimental, of course, to grow up without parents, but in other ways, he was so adaptable. He had many parents, he had many fathers, he had many mothers, so it made him a child of everybody.
Muhammad's clan, like Arabs all across the Arabian Peninsula, would share the stories that had been told and retold for generations.
Bedouin culture was an oral culture. It relied on phenomenal memory and was based on long-established traditional values, which were centered on the tribe.
To the Bedouin, oral tradition had a mystical importance. Poetry linked the tribe to its ancestors and celebrated values older than memory.
It was a high Arabic, which was understandable to all the tribesmen and gave them a feeling of a common cultural heritage and a shared identity.
Warfare and conflict were the grim realities of a dangerous time. Muhammad's uncle taught him the skills he'd need to survive in a world where even a prophet would wield a bow and arrow. In a wilderness punished by the elements and bereft of water, rivalry over a single well in Muhammad's time could provoke a blood feud for generations.
A real rivalry, real battles, and sometimes quite bloody. So the allegiance of individuals was to the family immediately, and at a larger extent to the tribe.
Like all clans, Muhammad's tribe had its own separate gods and totems to water and wind, fire and night. All the totems were kept and worshipped in the caravan town of Mecca in one place, a shrine of wood, stone and cloth called the Kaaba, Arabic for cube.
The Kaaba would have been dressed as if it were a human being. Imagine that, a building covered in textiles. Now, in this place would have been idols galore, and they're frightening. You can see why people would worship these images.
In these turbulent times, the Kaaba provided a rare place of peace. Only here would the Bedouins submit to a temporary truce before returning to their conflicts of the open sands.
There was this one place in the middle, around the Kaaba, which was a sacred enclosure where all people had to put down their arms. And this, of course, facilitated trading because it meant that you couldn't carry on your feuds when you were doing your buying and selling.
The Kaaba made Mecca a vibrant center for trade. Muhammad would have come here often. Here were found Arabian incense, exotic perfumes and Indian spices, Chinese silks and Egyptian linens. But Mecca's greatest treasure was its rich mixture of cultures.
Mecca was a caravan city. It was a center of commerce and trade. People came and sold their goods, exchanged ideas, got married. The nature of commerce and the nature of spirituality were not divorced. They went hand in hand.
Muhammad's world was a center of trade, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean, linking the aging empires of Byzantium and Persia to the great bazaars of India and China. Muhammad became a merchant. In fact, he had a great flair for trade. At the age of 25, while leading a caravan northward to Syria, his talents caught the eye of the shipment's owner, a wealthy widow named Khadija. She was so taken with Muhammad, she proposed marriage.
The relationship of Muhammad and Khadija was a very inspiring love story. It was also one with great symbolic significance because she is the first convert to Islam. The idea that women are repressed in Islam is not at all to do with the Quran. It's mainly to do with the way Islam is interpreted in the various societies where it comes to be.
Muhammad chose a life of simple contemplation.
Muhammad was a contemplative person. He thought a great deal. He would devote a whole month to live away from everything in a cave just to worship and contemplate.
While still a young man, in a cave above Mecca, Muhammad had an experience that would be the defining moment of his life.
Suddenly at night, he saw the sky full of light. And the vision appeared to him, saying to him, "Read." And he said, "I cannot read." He hugged him very tightly and then released him and said, "Read." And he couldn't read. He said, "I cannot read." So he hugged him again very tightly and then released him and said, "Read." He said, "I cannot read." He said, "Read in the name of thy Lord." And there, from that moment, the revelation began.
The months to come would bring more revelations. Powerful words of a lyrical quality, more beautiful than the most exquisite Arabic poetry.
The only miracle that Muslims believe in is Quranic language. How this extraordinary, poetic, sublime language came through the channel of this illiterate man.
Above all, Muhammad was to bear one message to his people, that there is only one God.
The first pillar is to say, La ilaha illallah. There is no God but Allah, one God.
The implications were staggering. One God meant one people. No more tribal divisions. To the poor and unprotected, the prospect was revolutionary.
In the ancient world of Arabia, which had been riven by tribal disunity and warfare, suddenly this message was incredible. Here was a man calling for social justice, and so for the Meccans, this was something completely unheard of.
Muhammad's following began to grow. His people call themselves Muslims, for those who surrender to God. They set out to preserve the message Muhammad had brought. The Quran was based upon Muhammad's spoken revelations.
The Quran was revealed orally, but very soon people realized that it had to be written down in order to make sure that it wasn't corrupted and that the original message was maintained. And from a very early date, and it's very unclear when that date was, because no early manuscripts of the Quran survive, people began copying it down.
The Quran is a revelation of spiritual teaching, of both ethical and social guidance. It was revealed and remains in Arabic.
You can never appreciate it in translations. You can never appreciate it if you learn Arabic as an adult. But if you grew into the culture, grew like myself in a home that spoke Arabic, you see the beauty.
With words alone, the Quran delivers its vision to the faithful. Its imagery conjures a picture of the afterlife that resonates with all the power of traditional Bedouin poetry. Yet for all the imagery of paradise in the Quran, there was no easy description of God.
Most of the Quran is about abstraction. It's about not describing the divine entity, even though the divine entity is given 99 names. Muslims are supposed to imagine the qualities of God without ever being able to see them or perceive them in a tactile description.
Rather than a physical image of God or of Muhammad, it is the beauty of the Quran itself that is celebrated in Islam.
Muslims felt from a very early time that the only just representation of God's word was the Quran itself, not any picture of God, certainly not because you couldn't represent God, and certainly not a picture of Muhammad because he wasn't divine. At certain times and places, people did represent the prophet, but he was represented with a white cloth over his face to hide his face. But these are not religious images. These are not images meant to be worshipped. They're not images of a saint or of God. They are images of Muhammad as a historical figure. You're not supposed to look at them and pray towards them. You're to learn more about the history of your religion with the emphasis on history from them.
As Muhammad's community grew, so did his enemies. His message was clearly directed at the prevailing values in Mecca, and his opponents were becoming increasingly aggressive towards him.
They taunted him for his lack of miracles. Why don't you perform miracles like other prophets have done?
Tribal leaders continued to define themselves by the gods of their ancestors and the totems of their tribe. To the non-believers, the idea that they would be judged by one God was an outrage. Muhammad's dismantling of their heritage and customs was deeply unsettling.
The Prophet's message was an attack on the Meccan way of life. It was an attack on their tribal society, their tribal values. It was an attack on their polytheism, and it was an attack on their purse.
Muhammad's followers were forced from the marketplace and starved. Those without clan protection were tortured and killed. In 619 AD, Muhammad's wife, Khadija, died, and his uncle as well. Gone were his first great love and his only protector. Here at last was the opportunity his enemies had been waiting for. But in the lush oasis town of Yathrib, north of Mecca, a refuge opened to Muhammad and his people. Clan rivalries had become deadly in the town, and they desperately needed a peacemaker.
These tribes were quarreling with each other, and they thought, well, there should be someone who can come and bring peace. Many followers of the Prophet were there, so why not invite Muhammad to come over?
Muhammad agreed to travel to Yathrib and settle their disputes in exchange for a safe refuge for his people. For Muhammad's followers, leaving the place of their ancestors, their families and tribes, was the ultimate test of devotion. In doing so, they began a new community. It was a turning point. For the first time, they were bound together not by blood, but by faith. In the course of a single caravan journey, Islam marks its true beginnings. That journey is known as the Hijrah. 622 in the Christian calendar marks the Muslim year 1. Muhammad's goal among the people of Yathrib was the same as his larger mission, to bring unity and peace with his message. The town was renamed as Medina, the city of the Prophet.
In the ancient world of Arabia, which had been riven by tribal disunity and warfare, suddenly this message was incredible. The notion of one God, of divine unity, changed Arab society forever.
To the divided clans of Medina, Muhammad offered a vision of solidarity. But even as he spread the word of Islam, he didn't challenge the beliefs of other faiths.
Islam sees itself in relationship to the earlier revealed religions of Judaism and Christianity and treats them as people of the book. It believes that God had revealed himself, his word, to mankind many times, to Moses, to Jesus, for example, but each time people went astray.
The Prophet set an example to everybody by being very ascetic in his own life. He was a man not given to too much pleasure, too much luxury. On the contrary, he was a very ascetic man.
As the Muslim community grew in Medina, a life of simple devotion and ritual developed. A freed Abyssinian slave named Bilal was the first to call believers to prayer at Muhammad's house.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar!
It was the first mosque.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah!
The first person who calls the call to prayer is Bilal, who is a black slave liberated by Islam, who stands up in the middle of the desert and with a beautiful singing voice recites the call.
The prayer really is to be in the presence of Allah. You begin your prayer by saying Allahu Akbar. You stand like that, raising your hands like that. Do you know, that is the surrender. That is the whole sign of surrender, because that is the basis of Islam, is to surrender to God.
It's said that while he was in Medina, Muhammad received a revelation, instructing those in prayer to face in the direction of the Kaaba in Mecca. Though now filled with pagan idols, it also remained known as a shrine for those who believed in one God. But even as the Muslims were praying towards Mecca, their enemies there were rallying in force. Their goal, to wipe out the Muslims. Muhammad's people began to gather arms. Though the Muslims prepared as best they could, they were outnumbered and outmatched by those who believed in many gods. They mustered a force of only 313, mostly old men and boys with few weapons, while the approaching Meccans were heavily armed and 1,000 strong. For years, Muhammad had tried to bring Islam to the people of Mecca peacefully. Now it was time to fight. The Muslims faced their own tribes, brother fighting brother, son against father.
The ideological cement was Islam. It was Islam which welded together and swept the Muslims forward.
For 3 years, the Muslim army held out against staggering odds. As word of the fighting spread, other Bedouin tribes saw God's hand in Muhammad's victories. One by one, the peoples of the desert began to join in his struggle. The Muslim army grew, and the tide began to turn. The Muslim forces advanced to the outskirts of Mecca. It was a furious siege that lasted for nearly a month.
The siege of Mecca is a very, very ferocious one. The Meccans have persecuted the Muslims, they've tortured them, they've killed them, they've tried to kill Muhammad time and time again. They've rallied against them in war.
In 630 AD, the terrified people of Mecca braced for the onslaught. Muhammad's army was returning home, now 10,000 strong. The vanquished knew the terrible fate that awaited them.
The temptation on the part of the Prophet for vengeance must have been very high, and the Meccans would have been expecting that. They must have been trembling with fear.
But Muhammad had a surprise in store for the fallen city.
The Meccans, who are obviously expecting to be put to the sword, find that Muhammad instead forgives them. And this is very, very important because it sets the precedent of how Muslims come into conquered cities and treat the population that surrenders to them.
But not all of Mecca escaped Muhammad's wrath. Flush with victory, his troops marched straight to the Kaaba. 7 times they circled the shrine, as those who had come to seek its protection appealed to their idols. But it was not the pagan people Muhammad had come to destroy. It was their gods. He raised his staff, and the tribal gods of his ancestors smashed into dust.
The breaking of the 360 idols outside the Kaaba is a tremendous symbol for the demolition of an old way of life, a deeply embedded old way of life, which is shattered by the eruption of Islam into that sacred space, and it's being transformed into a Muslim sanctuary. Polytheism is dead. Monotheism lives.
The destruction of the idols was a new beginning, a breaking from the past and the creation of a powerful new force. Mecca was just the beginning. One after another, the tribes of a nation were summoned to the fold and united under the banner of Islam. A worldwide community of faith was begun, born in an extraordinary alignment of history, personality, and conviction.
What Muhammad did was to bring a sense of solidarity, a sense of mission, and he united all these separate segments within the peninsula. From then on, moved eastward, westward, northward, southward.
The Muslims turned to the north, swept into present-day Lebanon and Syria. They continued west into Egypt and across North Africa, fortifying the coastline of the Mediterranean. Only the seas stopped them.
The Muslims came with a mission. They did not come to try to conquer, but to try to open the land. They do not interfere with the affairs of the people and their beliefs or their customs or their systems.
The Muslims absorbed the Sasanian Empire of Iran and 2/3 of the Christian Byzantine Empire. By now, the empire was larger than Rome. It stretched from Morocco in the west to the Indus River in the east, where the border of India is today.
These conquerors don't say, convert or die. They don't destroy whatever they find from civilizations before them. On the contrary, they build upon those civilizations.
It's the times that creates the movement and sometimes the men. The Roman Empire had collapsed. The Byzantine Empire wasn't strong enough. There was a need for a new vision, a new way of looking into life. And I think what happened at that time, Muhammad's mission, filled the void that the societies wanted. They really wanted some sort of solidarity in their lives.
The lessons of the Quran, so successful for the Muslims in Medina and Mecca, were playing out on a global scale. As the conquest swept through Syria, the Muslims held their Friday prayers in the Church of St. John the Baptist in Damascus, allowing its Christian congregation to continue their services on Sunday. As the Muslim community grew, they bought the old church from the Christian congregation and built a huge mosque on the site. With Byzantine artisans, they decorated it with golden mosaics of an Islamic paradise. The Great Mosque of Damascus would become a model for new mosques to come, all across the empire. The Arabs transformed their conquered lands, maintaining, improving, or expanding the infrastructure. In Tunisia, building on Roman ruins, they devised an ingenious system of water purification, using gravity to separate fresh water from sediments.
Part of this system were these two enormous basins that they built outside the city walls. The clean fresh water would flow over into the larger basin, where it would then be distributed by pipes to the city. This is, hundreds of years before anyone in Europe ever thought of having running water. All over you find schemes for bringing water from the mountains where there was more water to the plains where there might be less water.
They resurrected elaborate irrigation systems, filling the old stone aqueducts with water. Agriculture flourished as staples like wheat were introduced to the Mediterranean region. But Muslims saved their most monumental feat for the holy city of Jerusalem.
The Dome of the Rock is without doubt the first great masterpiece of Islamic architecture. It is uniquely visible. That site makes it a building that you can see almost anywhere in Jerusalem.
Like Mecca and the Kaaba, the significance of this holy site goes back to Abraham, for the rock within is said to be the place he nearly sacrificed his son. It was built to rival the nearby Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus was said to have been buried.
The diameter of the Dome of the Rock is the same within 1 centimeter as that of the Holy Sepulchre. Don't tell me that's an accident. So it's a building that is meant to upstage the Christian presence in Jerusalem and to Islamize Jerusalem, to re-sacralize the Temple Mount and make it Muslim.
In just 100 years, Muhammad's vision had transformed the spiritual and political map of the world, and his followers had established an empire larger than Rome. But Muhammad never lived to see it. In the 11th year of the Islamic calendar, 632 AD, only 2 years after the taking of Mecca, Muhammad died. Medina fell into despair. For days, the city was consumed with sorrow and ceremony.
The death of the Prophet was, of course, a shock. But more than that, he was, after all, the mediator between heavens and earth, between Allah and the people. And now that communication line is being cut off, finished. On his deathbed, the Prophet warned his followers, "Do not build a mosque on my grave, because if you do so, people will worship me, and only God is the one worthy of worship." And as a consequence, the Muslims just buried him where he died. He died in one of his houses, they buried him there. And it is his burial place to this very day.
Muhammad did not lead the conquest or create the empire to come. The transforming power of his message did. Out of that message would spring a font of knowledge that would transform humanity. As Islam continued to spread its reach far and wide, awaiting the Muslims would be a new age. They would be destined for enlightenment, for new horizons, and a clash of great powers, the like of which the world had never seen.
Tomorrow, the scholars who brought the ancient world into the modern Empire of Faith continues at 11:20 here on BBC Two. And if you'd like to take part in the community events that complement the BBC's Islam UK season, toll free phone 111 or visit the website at www.bbc.co.uk/Islam.